Thank you very much. I'll begin our questions today, followed by Ranking Member Morelli. We'll then alternate between parties, and because this is a joint hearing, alternate between membership of each committee by seniority, respectively. We have 57 members here, about 1/8 of the House of Representatives, and so I will hold us quite tightly to the 5 minutes. I'll now recognize myself for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. Ms. Evans, if I can start with you. You're the current executive director of the D.C. Board of Elections. You don't make election law, but you implement election policy. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And so in Washington, D.C., if you're a D.C. resident, you'd need a photo ID to board an airplane. You'd need a photo ID to buy a 6-pack of beer. Do you need a photo ID to vote in a D.C. election?
When an individual shows up to a vote center, they do not need to submit a voter identification.
So you don't need photo ID if you're voting in Washington, D.C., although you needed to buy a 6-pack of beer, you needed to board an airplane. Ms. Evans, did D.C. just pass a law that would allow non-citizens to vote in D.C. elections?
In D.C. local elections, that is correct.
So starting in 2024, next year, non-citizens will be allowed to vote in D.C., correct?
In local elections, that is correct.
So, Mr. Cuccinelli, if I can, Ms. Evans said not only does D.C. Allow non-citizens to vote, they don't require photo ID to vote in D.C. elections. Doesn't that mean that people who aren't eligible could vote in D.C. elections?
Yes, particularly when you have a system that isn't running very well in the first place, yes.
So isn't it important that people are who they say they are when they show up to the polls, and photo ID would help ensure that?
Absolutely, and that's actually the phrasing I recall Vice President Harris using in a BET interview about 2 years ago.
So, Mr. Cuccinelli, let me shift gears slightly. Under D.C.'s kind of crazy new non-citizen voting law, doesn't that mean that embassy staff at the Russian embassy or the Chinese embassy, after being in Washington, D.C. for just 30 days, could vote in D.C. elections?
That's exactly what it means.
And so if Washington, D.C. implemented photo ID for voting and allowed non-citizens to vote, an individual working at the Russian embassy could pull out a Russian embassy passport and vote in our nation's capital?
That's exactly right.
That's ridiculous. The ACE Act...
Also exactly right.
It's ridiculous. This is the nation's capital. We shouldn't have Russian embassy or Chinese embassy staff voting in our elections. In fact, only U.S. citizens should be voting in American elections. Mr. Cuccinelli, the ACE Act is the strongest conservative election integrity legislation to be considered in the House in a generation. But the left kind of comes at it with these visceral attacks, the same attacks that they tried to use in Georgia when Georgia passed their voter integrity provisions. In fact, last night, the Committee on House Administration Democratic Twitter account said the ACE Act directly threatens the district and our democracy. Does photo ID threaten the district and our democracy?
No, it protects it.
Does prohibiting non-citizens from voting, is that a threat to democracy?
It protects the democracy and the value of U.S. citizenship.
Does maintaining clean voter rolls, is that a threat to democracy?
No, it is a protection for democracy.
So what are they talking about?
They're talking about a 20-year-old narrative where they attack anything that makes elections cleaner and more secure and more transparent. It is not a new attack. It's been going on for a long time. This is just the modern version of it. We heard the Jim Crow 2.0. Charlie Spees touched on this, and Georgia was the center point of this over the last 2 years. That's where the real explosion took place.
And after all this hyperbole in Georgia, the President of the United States leans in, makes false claims. The Washington Post comes back, gives 4 Pinocchios to the president. The false narrative is driven. Major League Baseball removes the All-Star game from Atlanta off this false narrative. Then we get to the election. What happens in Georgia? Was the Democratic narrative proven true?
No, they had record turnout. The narrative was proven completely false. And one of the universities down there, obviously from the left side of the spectrum politically, polled after and found that 0% of black voters had a bad voting experience. And the black and white report of good voting experience was within tenths of a percent of one another, over 72% of both populations.
Which shows that putting in place good election integrity laws actually increases voter confidence and increases voter turnout across demographic groups. I think that's important. That's what the ASAC does. I appreciate your comments here, and I yield back. I'll now recognize